Cirrus 818 Golf Mike, 1,500. We're going for 3-3.
Missionary 1 Golf Mike, Addison Tower, runway 33, clear to wind 1505.
818 Golf Mike, thanks. Tower 818 Golf Mike, we're not going to make the airport. We're going for a road over here.
Roger.
Cirrus 818 Golf Mike, we've gone ahead and deployed the cap.
Second. All right, yeah. Hey, Golf Mike, Addison Tower, sound frequency.
That audio comes from liveatc.com on Sunday, September 30th at Addison, Texas Airport, and what you just heard was parachute pull number 79 for a Cirrus aircraft. The plane reported engine trouble. The pilot pulled the plane's cap's parachute, and I'm happy to report the two occupants walked away with just minor cuts in their arms. Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 77 of the Aviation News Talk podcast, where we bring you general aviation news and safety tips that pilots and student pilots like you can use. Today, our listeners talk about the 20 things they wish they had learned as student pilots, but later had to figure out as private pilots. Plus, coming up in the news, a Long Island flight instructor has been arrested after a crash, and we'll tell you why. Used Cessna 172 Skyhawks have jumped in value, and we'll tell you which model years have appreciated the most. The FAA has a new settlement policy for first-time violators of drug alcohol testing requirements. And the NTSB issues 7 new recommendations related to the Air Canada near miss at San Francisco last year. And one state is looking at conducting night flight operations to fight wildfires. And finally, an Air Force pilot has a rather novel idea for a potential non-military use of B-1 bombers in the United States. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Trescott. I'm here to educate and inform you and hopefully have a little fun. Along the way, I'll be sharing my over 40 years of experience as a pilot, author of the G1000 Glass Cockpit Handbook, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. I'm also a specialist in Cirrus aircraft like the SR20, SR22, and the SF50 Vision Jet. So if you're thinking about buying one of these aircraft or would like some training in one, please call me now for a free consultation and possibly a free demo flight. If you're new to the show, we typically do a weekly news-oriented show, including listener feedback and answers to questions. And occasionally, we'll do an interview show. Last week in episode 76, we talked about mental health issues and depression among pilots, and it was one of our most downloaded episodes ever. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. All this and more, and the news starts now. First up, a quick mention of the long-awaited FAA reauthorization bill. Funding for the FAA was due to expire over this past weekend, and last week the House passed the long-term bill. But the Senate wasn't able to vote on it before funding expired on September 30th. So prior to recessing for the weekend, the FAA passed a one-week FAA extension and filed cloture, which is a procedure for ending debate and taking a vote on the long-term FAA bill. Now, according to the Senate calendar, for Monday, October the 1st at 5 p.m., the Senate will resume consideration of the long-term FAA bill, and at 5:30 p.m., a vote is scheduled. Now, I've looked at the bill. It is 1,200 pages long, and if it passes the Senate and is signed into law, we'll talk about it in a future episode. From ABC7NY.com, a Long Island flight instructor involved in a deadly 2016 crash was arrested. The flight instructor of a plane that crashed in Long Island Sound in 2016, killing one of the students, has been arrested and accused of continuing to teach flying even though he'd lost his license. Authorities say 39-year-old Nelson Gomez was charged with serving as a flight instructor without a certificate, which is a felony. Gomez of Howard Beach, Queens, was instructing several students on a single-engine four-seat Piper Archer when the plane splashed down in the harbor in February 2016. One of the students was at the controls at the time. All 4 occupants were able to exit the plane into the water, but only 3 of them, Gomez, Austricio Ramirez, and Wady Perez, were rescued by Suffolk County police officers. Another student, 23-year-old Gerson Salmon Negron, died in the crash. Gomez surrendered his certification to the FAA in May 2016 and was barred from giving lessons the following month. Federal authorities recently learned Gomez has been giving flying lessons to students at Republic Airport in East Farmingdale. According to court documents, one student told authorities he flew with Gomez 18 times in 2017, while another said he flew with Gomez 12 times between 2016 and 2017. From NBAA.org, the FAA publishes a new settlement policy for first-time violators of drug and alcohol testing requirements. Policy is effective October 1st. Now, a pilot may qualify for the new settlement policy if he or she either received a verified positive result for a DOT-required drug test or received a DOT drug test alcohol result of 0.04 or above, or refused to submit to a drug or alcohol test in violation of FAA regulations, or acted or attempted to act as a crew member of an aircraft in commercial operations in violation of FAA regulations under this policy that prescribe the use or being under the influence or effects or having had prescribed levels of drugs or alcohol. To qualify for a settlement under the new policy, the pilot must negotiate and sign a settlement agreement with the FAA within 10 days. The pilot also waives his or her right to appeal and agrees to surrender his or her certificates and not to apply for a new certificate for at least 1 year. According to Elizabeth Vassar-Brown, an attorney at Cooling and Hebers PC, quote, "It's hard to see the upside to this new settlement policy from the pilot's perspective." She says that to be eligible for the new program, among other things, the pilot must agree to a 1-year revocation and waive the right to have the matter decided by an NTSB law judge or a court of competent jurisdiction. Vassar-Brown said, "Consider, however, even if the pilot successfully completes the program, the FAA may or may not provide the pilot with a special issuance or medical certificate that will get the pilot back flying. In general, according to the NBAA, a pilot facing an FAA violation should contact legal counsel for guidance before negotiating a settlement with the agency." From AOPA.org, used Skyhawks are a hot item. Prices for 40-year-old airplanes do not typically jump 20% in just a few months, but that's exactly what's happened to Cessna Skyhawks produced between 1968 and 1976. Rodney Martz, a senior aviation technical specialist in AOPA's Pilot Information Center, said the recent jump in sales prices for Skyhawks produced in the 1960s and 70s stands out as the largest percentage increase he has seen in many years. Through many years of service, Martz has never seen such a sharp increase in prices for used models as the $6,000 to $10,000 increase in the price of used Skyhawks produced between 68 and 76, shown in the latest quarterly report. VREF, which is a service from AOPA, which lists used aircraft prices, now lists retail prices up to $51,000 for a 1973 Cessna 172M with a mid-type engine, and that's a 24% increase since the prior quarterly report. And Brenda Tibbs, who operates Bravo flight training at the Frederick Municipal Airport, said, quote, "The people that I know have been shopping for planes. They kind of have to buy them quickly or they just get scooped up." She also noted that the hot demand extends to Cessna 150 models as well. Quote, "They were gone just as fast as you could ask about them." Prices for many other aircrafts of different vintages are also climbing, though not yet to the same degree as these older Skyhawks. New aircraft deliveries have also shown strength in the piston market, including Piper's recent success selling to both domestic and foreign flight training providers. And that's a welcome change. I remember back in the 80s and 90s, single-engine pistons would reliably increase in price 1 or 2% every year. But certainly for the last 10 or so years, prices have been declining. So this is a nice turnaround in appreciation for folks who own aircraft. Of course, if you're trying to buy one, you may want to go out there sooner than later to make your purchase. From CNBC.com, night flying by fire agencies in California gains interest as the state's wildfire threat grows. Night flying by California fire agencies could become more frequent in coming years given the increasing wildfire risk and drought conditions around the state. Fire agencies in local jurisdictions in Southern California have taken the lead and are already conducting night operations using rotary wing aircraft to slow or stop fires quickly before they can get out of control. Quote, "In the future, you're going to see it proliferate," said Mike Sagely, a senior helicopter pilot with LA County Fire. Quote, "Night firefighting is important because typically fires tend to lay down at night and the fire behavior is much less aggressive." Now, overall, CAL FIRE has 50 aircraft in its fleet, but currently doesn't have nighttime aerial firefighting capability with its equipment. That could change once the agency gets a dozen new Black Hawk helicopters, including some capable of flying with night vision goggles. Now, the surge in wildfire activity has come as the recent drought monitor shows about 2/3 of California is in moderate or severe drought, and portions of the state near Arizona are in extreme drought. The night aerial firefighting that doesn't occur in the state is focused on helicopters operated by fire agencies in several counties of Southern California. In Northern California, though, daily air attack operations tend to shut down at sunset. While helicopters have proven useful in controlling night fires, there's still some debate whether fixed-wing air tankers are safe enough to use after dark to combat fires. Advances in technology could make them more acceptable for night missions in the coming years to slow or stop spreading fires. According to FAA spokesperson Ian Greger, there are no specific regulations pertaining to nighttime aerial firefighting operations, but there are rules that, quote, prohibit careless or reckless operations. A pilot involved in nighttime wildfire fighting operation should fly so that he or she can remain safe away from any other aircraft, as well as obstacles and or terrain, and doesn't pose a hazard to people on the ground. And this would be really quite remarkable, I think, if the technology could help air tankers stay in the air at nighttime, because certainly the wildfire season is now virtually year-round here in California. We could use all the help we can get. And from my maxtruscott.com blog, an article that I posted on Patreon about a week ago, the NTSB adopted 7 recommendations in the wake of Air Canada Flight 759 incident at San Francisco, in which an A320 jet nearly landed on a taxiway last year and overflew 4 fully loaded passenger jets. At their board meeting, which I watched throughout the day as part of a webcast, the board heard a presentation by NTSB staff that included 19 findings from the incident, 7 recommendations, and the final probable cause of the incident. And NTSB Chairman Walt Zumwalt said that the incident was a very close call. The NTSB determined the probable cause as the flight crew's misidentification of taxiway Charlie as the intended landing runway, which resulted from the crew members' lack of awareness of the parallel runway closure due to their ineffective review of notice to airmen, that is, NOTAMs, information before the flight and during the approach briefing. Contributing to the incident were 1, the flight crew failure to tune the ILS frequency for backup lateral guidance, expectation bias, fatigue due to circadian disruption, and length of continued wakefulness and breakdowns in crew resource management, and 2, Air Canada's ineffective presentation of approach procedure and NOTAM information. Now, the NTSB staff noted that the Air Canada crew did not recall reading in the 10 pages of NOTAMs they were given for their flight that runway 28 left was closed as they arrived at San Francisco. The NTSB staff did note that ** new ** preceded the runway closure NOTAM. Now, NOTAMs were really a pretty frequent target of board members throughout the day, and one of them said that the NOTAM system was, quote, really messed up. Someone else said that NOTAMs were written in a way that, quote, only a software programmer would understand. And one staff member estimated that it would have taken the flight crew 20 minutes to thoroughly read and understand all of the NOTAMs issued for Flight 759. Staff also noted that the crew flew the Quiet Bridge Visual Approach, which includes near the very end of its 2-page description a requirement to tune an ILS frequency in their FMS system to provide backup guidance to the runway. The crew failed to tune in the ILS frequency, which would have showed them that they were not properly lined up for runway 28 right. As staff did note that the Air Canada Airbus A320 automatically auto-tunes frequencies for all other approaches into San Francisco, but not for the Quiet Bridge approach. Crew fatigue could also have been a factor. The flight crew was a reserve crew. Of course, that's a crew that stands by and may have to fly on short notice an aircraft that suddenly needs a crew. And the captain had been awake for 19 hours at the time of the incident. The flight originated in Toronto, and it was 3 a.m. East Coast time when the incident occurred in San Francisco. Now, what really surprised me the most was the crew stated afterwards that they were unaware that they'd overflown 4 aircraft on the taxiway. That surprises me because when you look at the video, you can actually see those aircraft being lit up by the landing lights of the Air Canada. Also, the crew estimated that they started their go-around at 400 feet while data shows that it was initiated at 89 feet above the ground. After the go-around was initiated, the plane descended to a minimum altitude of 60 feet before beginning to climb. Staff estimated that the Flight 759 was approximately 10 to 20 feet above the tails of the aircraft on the taxiways. As a result of their investigation, the NTSB made 7 new recommendations, 6 for the FAA and 1 for Transport Canada. Number 1, work with air carriers to assess all charted visual approaches with a required backup frequency to determine that the FMS system's auto-tuning capability within an air carrier's fleet. Also identify those approaches that require an unusual or abnormal manual frequency input, and also develop an auto-tune solution to ensure that the manual tune entry has sufficient salience on approach charts. 2, establish a group of human factors experts to review existing methods for presenting flight operation information to pilots, and it continues on, but this is essentially about NOTAMs and the difficulty of deciphering them. 3, establish requirements for airplanes landing at primary airports with Class B and C airspace to be equipped with a system that alerts pilots when an airplane does not align with a runway surface. 4, collaborate with manufacturers to develop the technology for a cockpit system that provides an alert to pilots when an airplane is not aligned with the intended runway surface. And once such technology is available, establish a requirement for that technology to be installed on airplanes landing at primary airports within the Class B and Class C airspace. And I should mention that the late model Cirruses that I fly, particularly the 2017 and 2018 models, actually have just that kind of capability. If you were to fly an instrument approach, for example, and then circle to another runway, it will yell at you and tell you that you're landing on the wrong runway, or even tell you if you're lined up for a taxiway. Recommendation number 5 was to modify the surface radar capability at airports so that it could detect potential taxiway landings and provide alerts to air traffic controllers about potential collision risk. By the way, the 35 airports that currently have that installed, the system is set up only to detect collisions on runways. And so that's why this potential collision on a taxiway was not automatically flagged by the system at San Francisco. Number 6, conduct human factors research to determine how to make a closed runway more conspicuous to pilots. And staff noted during the all-day meeting that the large X at the end of a runway is really meant for someone lined up with that runway to know that the runway was closed, and that it doesn't really provide much visibility to pilots who are offset landing on other runways. There was also one recommendation to Transport Canada, which was to revise current regulations to address the potential for fatigue for pilots on reserve duty who are called to operate evening flights that would extend into the pilot's window of circadian low. And I guess what I can say is that the biggest single takeaway from this incident is that this crew initiated the go-around procedure almost at the last possible moment. If they'd waited literally another second or two, they could have crashed into those aircraft on the ground. So as I always say, anytime something doesn't look right, boy, a pilot should initiate an immediate go-around. Now, we had a number of comments on Patreon about the NOTAM system, and I'll read those when we get to the listener feedback later in this episode. In international news, here's a rather novel idea. Pay only when you fly insurance. This comes to us from flyer.co.uk, and it says pilots who fly just a few times a month or even a year are now being offered insurance coverage for their aircraft on demand. That is just when you fly it. The aircraft will still be covered full-time when it's parked, but the pilot can buy the legally required insurance just for when he or she goes flying. The insurance is called Fly Covered and has just been launched by specialist insurers Tokyo Marine Kiln, that's TMK, Covered Insurance, and brokers 3XD. Customers can manage their policies, purchase flight days, and even cancel flight days online instantly from a smartphone, PC, or tablets. Now, Fly Covered's 3 policy options are ground cover, that's an annual ground coverage with the option to purchase flight days when needed. On demand, that's annual ground cover with 7 days of flight cover included, and additional days will be purchased when needed at a fixed daily rate, and frequent flyer, which is the traditional comprehensive annual aviation insurance. Quote, regulations require pilots to have public liability coverage when flying, and this coverage can be added to the policy even on the same day as you intend to fly. Many pilots only get to fly 15 to 20 times a year, and traditional insurance policies do not offer the flexibility required for this market. With Fly Covered, pilots have access to the benefits of a fully comprehensive policy and can save money by only paying for the flight days they need. Well, this is certainly a novel idea, so we'll see if this catches on in other countries as well. And finally, from PopularMechanics.com, you're going to really love the title of this article. Should the U.S. Air Force bomb forest fires? Interesting idea. Earlier this summer, the Swedish Air Force dropped a laser-guided bomb on a forest fire to help suppress the flames. Now there's a proposal for the United States to do the same, using the might of the U.S. Air Force to fight America's raging forest fires via bombs and sonic booms. And the article says that F-15 Strike Eagle Weapons System Officer Mike Bennett wrote in WarOnTheRocks.com a proposal for using B-1 bombers, as they say, stuffed to the gills with bombs to battle the wildfires on the American home front. The idea, they say, is to snuff out fires the way you might blow out birthday candles. Apparently in Sweden, the shockwave from a single bomb snuffed out flames within a 100-yard radius of the impact point. So Bennett's reasons, why not load up a heavy strategic bomber with up to 84 bombs and do some serious firefighting? He also says that while this B-1 method is theoretically doable, it could be too expensive and dangerous. However, perhaps a big bomber like the B-1 or many smaller jets could instead fly low and fast over wildfires using the pressure waves from sonic booms to snuff out fires. Bennett points out an aircraft will generate a sonic boom along the length of its flight path at a rate of 1 mile per 1,000 feet. This could beat out wildfires over a wide area and could be repeated as many times as necessary. Although expensive, the increasing scale and frequency of wildfires in the United States could make them more attractive, especially when firefighting bombers have the potential to reverse a deadly and destructive fire within minutes. And that's the news for this week. Coming up, listeners tell us about the 20 things their CFIs didn't teach them as student pilots. Plus, listener feedback and questions. One pilot asked for recommendations on landing a Cessna 172 in a crosswind. Stick around because we'll be right back here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. In a moment, we'll be talking about the 20 things your CFI didn't teach you as a student pilot, and I want to thank everyone who sent in material for that particular segment that's coming up. Before we get to that, let me give you a few quick updates. In the middle of this recording, I just received a new listener question, and it was rather moving, so I'm going to push it to the top of the stack and include it. Gentleman from Alaska asked about losing friends as pilots. He's lost a couple of friends recently, and it's a tough topic. We try and address the tough topics here on this show, so I'm going to talk about that here at the end of the show. Before that, a couple updates. I was on Simple Flight Radio. If you're not familiar with them, they have been running a live show for quite some time on Sunday nights. Two guys out of the Midwest, Mark Epner and Al Waterloo. Both of them are in sales. Al sells Cirrus aircraft. He works for Cirrus. And Mark sells software. He's in the high-tech industry. So they had me on a recent show, and you can find that on simpleflight.net. And I'm going to play a brief segment now. You're going to hear Mark Epner making a comment, and then I'll respond.
And I got a little distracted, but no problem. And I'm looking, I'm doing my scan, but all of a sudden I went into a much deeper descent than I wanted. And it's just, we can say we can read about it and we can practice it, but somehow when the stuff hits the fan, it just seems like we as private pilots, at least, tend to forget, tend to not being able to execute.
And I think it helps to start to identify where are the critical situations. Both of you were talking about, Al was talking about a descent into Denver. You were talking about a turn. But both of those to me are kind of critical type situations where you got to pay more attention than usual. Usually when we're up in cruise, hey, we can relax, we can kick back a little bit. But as a CFI, I'm always, at full heightened state of alert when people are in the traffic pattern, because I know that if there's a problem, there's not a whole lot of time to recover. And I think private pilots need to be thinking about the same thing. It's like, what are the critical phases of flight? Where do I need to absolutely eliminate distractions? For example, by briefing passengers that, they need to be quiet while you're making a landing, for example. And so they can then really just focus all their time and mental resources on those critical areas. And I think then they're more likely to fly at the correct airspeed or descend at the correct rate. Probably the best thing I think to do is for pilots just to practice every time making the perfect flight. Now, I don't think we ever achieve the perfect flight, but I think we should strive for it on every single flight. And just think about every aspect of the flight. Try and make every part of it to the standard that you would expect a professional pilot to uphold. And frankly, when I train private pilots, I'm training them to be professional. Doesn't matter whether you get paid in aviation, you still should try to be professional in all of your flying. And we talked for about an hour, according to their show notes. We talked about night flying. We talked about this podcast. We talked about quality in flight training among flight instructors. We also talked about transitioning into an aviation career from whatever you happen to be doing now. And you can find this, as I mentioned before, at simpleflight.net online, or it's also available in podcast form. If you go into the Apple Podcast app and search for Simple Flight, which is all one word, radio, you'll find it there. And I mentioned earlier in the show about the NTSB meeting that was held on Monday, September 23rd on the Air Canada incident at SFO. Early that morning, I received an email from someone at KCBS Radio in San Francisco asking if I would be available to be interviewed about that. And this is what the beginning of that interview sounded like.
KCBS News Time, 9:32.
The National Transportation Safety Board is meeting this morning to determine the probable cause of Air Canada's close call at SFO. This incident occurred in July of last year when an Air Canada jet lining up for a landing wound up coming extremely close to four other jets that were filled with passengers on a taxiway waiting to take off. For more on today's meeting, we're joined on the KCBS Ring Central Newsline by Max Trescott, a Bay Area pilot and host of the Aviation News Talk podcast. Thanks for joining us this morning. Where does a meeting like this start, and where do they pull their information in from?
Good morning to you. They're going to have information that they've gathered over the past year. So, for example, they got information from radar systems at San Francisco International Airport. They got reports from people who were witnesses to the incident, people who were in the cockpit at the time. And typically, I think they're going to go through the outline of exactly what happened, what the factors were that led to this occurring, and then try and find ways that they can avoid similar incidents in the future.
So just to walk us back to when this all happened, you had these parallel runways at SFO 28 right and 28 left, and one of them was shut down and the lights were turned off. In other words, it was out of service. Pilots have used SFO knowing there are these parallel runways. Is that what seems to have been the triggering event here?
You know, it's kind of interesting. There was a similar event that just occurred this past August, a little over a month ago in Philadelphia. And there were common themes were that it was night and that someone did mistake a taxiway for a runway. In this case here in San Francisco, yes, the lack of lights on the 28 left led the pilot to believe that he was looking at the runway when he was in fact lined up with the taxiway. It's pretty common for pilots to use references around the airport to kind of figure out exactly where they are and what they're lining up with. In this particular case, he was offset by one set of pavement because he misinterpreted where the lights were. Well, it was fun being back on the radio again and being interviewed by KCBS. They used to be owned by CBS, and years ago, I actually worked for CBS. I was an employee at one of the other stations they own, WCAU 1210 AM News Talk in Philadelphia. So that was kind of a fun connection to make there. And I've always been a fan of the News Talk format, and hence the name of this show, Aviation News Talk. So now you know. By the way, for folks who have downloaded our Aviation News Talk app, a number of you have enabled notifications, and if you have, you received a notification from me last Monday. And that notification included a link to the live NTSB meeting on Air Canada that you could then go out and watch. Now, it may have been a little confusing to some. It was certainly confusing to me. I've only ever sent a couple of notifications, and the documentation on the app is not perfect, so I'm still figuring out some things. So here's what I have learned afterwards. When I do send a notification, which will show up on your Android or show up on your iPhone just like any other notification, if you click on that notification, it takes you to the Aviation News Talk app on your phone. It might not be obvious what to do next. It certainly wasn't to me. At that point, if you just click on the upper left-hand corner of the app, just keep clicking there until you see a listing for Inbox. And then in the inbox, you'll find the notifications. And if you click on that notification in the inbox, it will then take you to the link that I may have provided in that particular notification. So just one more little bit of detail there. So hopefully that will help you out. And I want to thank everybody who has downloaded our app. It's real easy to do. It's free. Just go out to the App Store in either iPhone or the Google Play Store for Android phones. Do a search just like you would for any other app that you've ever downloaded for your phone. Type in Aviation News Talk, 3 separate words, and you'll find our dedicated app. Download it, and if you enable notifications, you'll be able to receive any notifications that I send out in real time for things that I think might be of interest to you. And I want to thank Miller Hogan. He's one of our Patreon supporters, and he mentioned the show in his blog, which you can find at privatepilotchronicles.com. Now, he decided to fly down to Scottsboro, Alabama with his wife, and that was to visit, get this, the unclaimed baggage store. And you can imagine what that is. All of that baggage left over for the airlines, well, it eventually gets sold through a store like this. So it must be a pretty interesting place to go shopping. Anyway, he mentioned in the article that he was a little high and he was a little fast, and he just wasn't feeling good about the approach. But then he said he heard this little voice in the back of his head that was saying, you can always go around. And he asked himself, would he listen to that voice? So let me read one paragraph. Miller wrote, he says, I try to consume as much continuing aviation education as I can. One resource I really like and enjoy is the Aviation News Talk podcast. If you are a pilot or interested in general aviation, you must have this podcast in your rotation. I have learned a great deal from it. In addition to the voices of my instructors and fellow Flight Club members, the host of this show, Max Truscott's voice, was also ringing in my ears. In a recent episode discussing the go-around decisions, Max said, at the first moment you think maybe I should go around, you should go around. Well, it's a fun story to read. You can find it at privatepilotchronicles.com, and I'll include a link to it in the show notes so you can read it. Just click on the artwork of your podcast player, and you should find the link. And Miller, thanks so much for sharing this story and for going around. And I've probably mentioned that about 4 years ago, I picked up RC plane flying because my wife was interested in doing it. Well, she gave me what became my favorite airplane earlier this year, which was a Cirrus SR20, great little plane. And I only had about 7 or 8 flights on it when, you'll never guess what happened. I had my first ever midair collision. Well, it turns out that the RC model does not include the parachute, so it came tumbling down after it hit the other airplane. I have since repaired it. It's not quite as good as it was, but I just wanted to share what I thought was the root cause of that particular accident, because believe it or not, I think it also applies to general aviation. I'm not that great of an RC flyer, and so I generally like to stand there by myself and not talk with other people while I'm flying. But would you know, somebody came over and had questions, and I was proud to talk about my great little Cirrus RC plane. And in the process, I realized I got distracted, and so the other person whose airplane collided with me, or who we mutually collided together with, he said, "Gee, I thought my plane was farther away," meaning he was out there looking at our airplanes, and I realized, heck, I wasn't even looking. I didn't see your airplane until I heard the noise. So what I realized was, yep, really my fault. I got distracted. And I think that's important for any type of flying. It's real easy to get distracted. So just think about that. Anytime something deviates from the normal pattern of your flying, think of it as a potential distraction, and hopefully you'll avoid any problems as well. Good news is this is an RC plane. It's easy to replace. But oh, was I sad to see my baby spinning down to the earth. And also, let me tell you where I'm going to be over the next month or two. We've got a new place, and this one will probably surprise you. So the places I've already mentioned, I'm going to be in Carbondale, Illinois, speaking on October 5th, in Gulf Shores, Alabama on October 26th. I'll be giving my advanced IFR presentation for 3 hours at the AOPA regional fly-ins at those locations. I've also mentioned the Cirrus Migration 16, and of course, you know by now that that's not just for Cirrus owners, but anybody who flies a higher power aircraft like a Cessna 182, a 206, a Mooney, Piper Beechcraft, whatever. It's going to be in Las Vegas, October 11th to 14th. I'm giving a presentation on night flying safety. Come join us there if you can. Fly into the Henderson Executive Airport, and the presentations and also the vendor trade show are going to be at the Grass Valley Resort and Spa. I'll put a link to that in the show notes, and hopefully you'll see us there. Now, here's the new one. This one's pretty exciting. November 9th through the 11th, I'm going to be at a Cirrus CPPP. That's the Cirrus Pilot Proficiency Program, a weekend-long program in Orange, Australia, and New South Wales. So this is going to be my first time ever to Australia, so I'm really looking forward to that. And I believe my wife is going to be coming along with us, so we're going to do not just the weekend, obviously, but also spend some time looking around the country. So if any of our listeners down under have suggestions on where we should go and things we should see, definitely send me a note. And I'm also wondering, while we're there, should we hop over to New Zealand? Anyway, all these things we'll figure out here in the next 6 weeks or so, but that's pretty exciting. And speaking of exciting, if you really love the show and you're looking for just a little bit more after you get done, well, head on out to our Patreon site. I post a lot of things out there every week, some of which make it in the show later and some of which don't. So go ahead and check it out. You can just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Click on blog and you can see all my posts there. And some of the recent blog posts there include a link to a video by AOPA's Air Safety Institute on the Houston Hobby Airport SR20 traffic pattern accident, which I think I'm going to be talking with on another podcast with someone pretty soon, so we'll tell you about that when that occurs. Also, I'm going to post a midair collision that occurred down in Florida. Now, this occurred very close to the runway. Both parties survived, but it was kind of interesting to see that you can still have a midair when you're very low to the ground. And finally, AOPA has just posted their Rusty Pilot Seminar online, and you can find a link to all that presentation material at our Patreon site. I do want to thank our new Patreon supporters this past week, who include Scott Sutton, Jeffrey Boatwright, David DeCurtis, Bill Johnson, who edited his pledge up to $8 a month, Russ Irwin, and Florian Müller from Deutschland. And also thank SB. He edited his pledge up to $8 a month. And also thank Antoine Honeycomb. He is one of our large contributors, and he is from down under, down in Australia. So check out the Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And if you'd like to go ahead and donate, that's fine too. And if you don't, well, we're happy to have you as a listener. And now stick around, because in 7 seconds, we're going to share what you told me your CFI didn't teach you as a student pilot, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Yeah, welcome back. What makes the show work really well for me is I get a lot of feedback from listeners, and I want to thank Bruce in West Virginia. He sent me an email all the way back in March, and it was the catalyst for this show. He wrote and he said, "My PPL training, I think, did a great job of preparing me to get the certificate. However, I think it fell well short of preparing me to be a real-world pilot. As a few examples, once I started venturing out on my own, I quickly learned that I had no idea how to use a self-service fuel pump. I didn't know the right way to approach them, how to use them, or the general etiquette surrounding them. When taxiing up to an FBO, I didn't know what that guy in the vest was doing waving those orange sticks around." He says, "Okay, well, I did have an idea what he was, but didn't know any of the nuances of being marshaled. Or, at an airport without a marshal, where were the appropriate places to park? And are you expected to tip? If so, to whom? Under what circumstances? And again, what is generally appropriate? When you call up an FBO before a trip, what information do you like to get? And what do you want them to provide?" So I guess what I'm suggesting is a discussion of the ins and outs of being a member of the community without having to learn everything by trial and error. Kind of a, quote, beyond the certificate, unquote, so to speak. Perhaps I was just slow on the uptake, but I wonder if this sort of thing may help other new pilots be more comfortable and encouraged to venture out more, or teach veterans a different way to do things. Keep up the great work, Bruce. Bruce, no, you're not slow on the uptake. Your message really resonated with me, because I realized, yes, some of the things you talked about were foreign to me. And guess what? When we ask listeners to respond, they came up with a number of the same kinds of things. So let's hear first from Jim Pittman. I've known Jim for over 10 years. He's one of our Patreon sponsors, and he's an airline pilot.
Hi, Max. Jim Pittman here. Thank you so much for having this discussion. It's been over 25 years since I earned my private pilot certificate. So I took the liberty of kind of expanding your question to include things that I've seen in other pilots that we both wish they would have learned, either during their training or shortly after. And came up with 7 items for you. Number 1 is the self-serve fuel. I think you posted about that recently, and I definitely agree that pilots need help understanding both the procedures and the etiquette related to using self-serve fuel. So that's a good one.
Good point, Jim. Let's talk about self-serve fuel. First off, when you approach the fuel pump, you want to be careful that you have figured out a strategy for getting the airplane back away from the fuel pump. Some people like to go ahead and come in beside the fuel pump so that one of their wings is close to the pump. If you do that, you're going to have to pull the hose way out to get to the far wing, and that's okay. I often like to just approach the pump directly, pull straight up to the pump. That way I've got a fairly short distance to get to either wing from the pump. And then, of course, I have to push the airplane back. And don't just park at the fuel pump and go get lunch. You may be blocking somebody else who wants to use that pump, who shows up shortly after you have left the airplane. A big thing is the heavy weight of the nozzle and the hose. You may find, particularly if you're a high-wing aircraft, that it's helpful to kind of drape that hose over your shoulder. And to get up there for a high wing, you probably need somebody else to help you. Go ahead, climb up on the wing yourself, and then have that other person hand the hose up to you. And if you put it over your shoulder, that's going to keep it from tugging away at the inside of the filler port. Now, the filler ports, you got to be really careful. Some of them are made out of soft aluminum, and if you just put the nozzle in and let the weight of the hose, bend against that soft aluminum, you're going to potentially crack and break that inner portion of the filler cap. So the best thing is to never just let it lie at an angle supported by its own weight inside the filler hole. You need to actually hold the nozzle in the center of the filler hole. Otherwise, as I said, you can break that soft aluminum that holds the outer cap. Also, when you insert it, be careful not to insert it too far. For example, many aircraft like the Cirrus and also Pipers will have a tab inside, and I have seen many of these tabs bent to the point where they are useless. The tabs no longer give a good indication of how much fuel is in the airplane when the fuel is up to the tab, because someone has carelessly inserted a nozzle into that wing and bent that tab out of position. Now, there are a couple of other tricks for self-fuel pumps. Invariably, you're going to have to first ground the aircraft before you can proceed. Then they're going to want a credit card. And then, depending on the system, you may have to do a whole lot of moving of cursors back and forth and selecting just to type in your N number. Nice ones will have a keypad, but many of the other ones just have kind of left and right cursors that you use to eventually select one letter at a time very painfully. And then when you're all done, usually there is one switch somewhere near the pump that you have to throw. And with the location that varies, but usually it's a pretty large arm. It's probably at least 6 inches long. You need to find that and throw that switch. Now, when you're done fueling, be careful if you've got some type of automated system that rolls that hose back up. You're going to want to let that hose go in without being kinked, because these fuel hoses are really large, and you may take a couple attempts to get it back into the reel. And some of them will have a button you'll push, which will help you do that.
Number 2, 6 sacks for passengers. I think this is something that we could all put more focus on. I've had many people throw up in the airplane over the years. It's always been in a 6-sack, I'm happy to say. And I've heard of other people who did not have a 6-sack handy, and that is not a mess that I want to have to clean up. So not only do I carry 6 sacks for my passengers, I actually keep several in my knee board at all times, but it's a regular part of my passenger briefing. Might be a little bit of an uncomfortable conversation, but it's a lot better than having to deal with not having the conversation. Number 3 on my quick list is operations at busy airports. Specifically, I'm thinking like Class Charlie operations, doing a VFR departure, the need to call a clearance delivery to get a VFR clearance and a squawk code. Pilots who have never been exposed to that, it can be awkward and even overwhelming. It's not difficult when you know how to do it, but that's something that I think would be something to focus on.
Good point. If you're a Class C or a Class B airport, there may be a clearance delivery frequency, and you'll just find it by looking at your list of frequencies, either within your application like ForeFlight or Garmin Pilot, or if you happen to have a copy of the AFD. Now, this is one thing that's not that big a deal if you end up calling ground first, because if they want you to clearance delivery, they'll just tell you. So it's kind of a minor oops, but in the grand scheme, not a big deal. But it is important to get your clearance coming out of these airports, because typically you'll be given a squawk code as well as an initial heading to fly and an initial altitude to climb to, as well as a departure frequency. Next, you're going to call ground and tell them you're ready to taxi. Finally, you'll tell tower you're ready to take off. And soon after you take off, tower will then tell you to contact departure on the frequency that you were given by clearance delivery.
Number 4 is calling flight service to give a PIREP, something that we could all do better on, or even just calling to get an update on weather, update a flight plan. Flight service is there to help. A lot of pilots don't seem to know that it's okay to get a momentary frequency change, even doing VFR flight following or being on an IFR flight. Controllers are fine giving a momentary frequency change. Worst thing they're going to say is, hey, I'm about to hand you off. Go ahead and switch to this next controller, and then you can ask them for a momentary frequency change. And switch over, have a nice conversation with flight service, and then report back up on the original frequency. No big deal. And of course, going along with that is knowing how to find flight service frequencies on the aeronautical charts and use that information.
Okay, a pop quiz. You'd be expected to know this on your private check ride. Where do you find a flight service frequency? Well, if you pull out a sectional chart, just look for the nearest VOR. There's going to be an information box, a rectangle. Inside the box, it's going to have information about the VOR. Above the box and just below the box, you're going to have information about flight service. Above the box are going to be the frequencies. Below the box, the name of the flight service station name. And when you look at those frequencies on top, check to make sure there's no R after the frequency. If there's an R, you're going to have to transmit on that frequency that has the R, and you're going to have to simultaneously listen to the VOR frequency over your nav radio. And to set that up so that you're transmitting on one frequency and receiving on another, boy, it's going to require a lot of button pushing. So you might want to practice doing that beforehand.
All right, number 5 on my quick list, courtesy cars at airports. The most FBOs, well, I really don't know. I've never done an analysis, but it seems like most FBOs have a courtesy car that they'll let pilots use for free, especially if you bought a few gallons of gas. Go into town, maybe even take it to the hotel for the night. Everyone's going to have different policies on that, but it doesn't hurt to ask. And kind of along the same lines, booking a hotel. I think most everyone has their favorite way of booking hotels. Go ahead and check those sources, but also ask the FBO. A lot of times they've got deals with the local hotels where they can get you a better price. So just go through the local FBO if you need to get a hotel somewhere you're flying to.
And remember the word courtesy when you have a courtesy car. And courtesy is that you put gas in the car before you return it. So put back in at least as much as you used. And if you're really a nice person, put in a little extra.
And then last but not least on my list, number 7, packing food. You've talked about this several times when you talk about ferrying airplanes across the country. And yes, it's important to stay hydrated and well-fed. Something I didn't really focus on. In fact, looking back years ago when I worked for Cessna and I was flying a Skyhawk all over the Western U.S. doing, 1, 2, or 3 day trips typically, I didn't realize it at the time, but there was a certain amount of, anxiety or just, not knowing where my next meal was coming from. When I get to where I'm going, is there going to be a restaurant on the airport or near my hotel? Or this was before we had Uber or Lyft. So, questions like, am I really going to rent a cab just to go get dinner? And when I decided to take up the airline job a little over 2 years ago, one of the first captains I flew with actually gave me some dual instruction on how to pack food for trips. And it might seem like a simple thing, but there's a little bit of an art to it. And it's just so nice knowing that I've got my food with me. It doesn't matter if I get delayed or I'm stuck somewhere or there's no restaurants near the airport or hotel. I've got my food with me, and that just really relieves that anxiety, because I'm definitely a 3 meals a day kind of guy. So that's my quick list. I'm sure I'll think of more after I send you this recording, but thanks again for doing this, having this discussion. It is important. Really, you're letting pilots know what they don't know. And the solution to these things can be as simple as thinking about it or looking up a quick YouTube video. But you gotta know to go looking for the information first. So thanks again for doing it. Keep up the great work. We'll talk to you later.
Jim, you make a great point about figuring out your food ahead of time. On the long trips that I make across the country, losing an hour and a half to get a courtesy car and go to a restaurant is just not in the plan. So we always bring food with us on those trips. We'll get large submarine sandwiches the night before, keep them in the refrigerator, and that way we've got something to munch on throughout the day. Just as some counterexamples, I remember on one of my very first trips back in 2006, bringing a brand new Columbia from the factory in Oregon out to Lincoln Park, New Jersey with a doctor from New York. I suggested to him that we order food ahead of time. So he called the FBO at Rapid City, ordered a couple sandwiches for us. And sure enough, they were there when we got there. It was about a $50 bill for those 2 sandwiches, which I think had been prepared by a local catering company downtown and driven quite some distance to get out to the airport. But a better success story I saw back in December as I was taking a Cirrus from California to Miami. We stopped at the Mobile downtown airport in Alabama. And as we were waiting, a pizza was delivered to the front desk of the FBO. And perhaps 10, 15 minutes later, a citation arrived, the crew got out, picked up the pizza, ate it, and then they were gone in a few minutes. So thanks so much, Jim. Really excellent. And Jim says that if anybody's interested in more information about packing food for trips or anything else that he's mentioned, you are welcome to contact him directly through his website at flywithjim.com. Now let's hear from Dispatcher Mike.
Hey Max, it's Dispatcher Mike from the Flying Life podcast. To answer your question of the month of what is something that you wish your CFI had taught you and you learned on your own after getting your certificate, I experienced something this week on my cross-country journey to Oshkosh. It's kind of funny. Cross-country is through private training is anything over 50 nautical miles. Here's a trip that I did from central Georgia up to Wisconsin, a literally cross-country flight. And the thing that I don't think you ever get taught as a pilot, especially a general aviation pilot, is where are you going to stop? Good airport planning. Where are you going to do your fuel stops at? Where are you going to overnight at? I made it up to where my parents were, and so I knew I had lodging, but where are you going to stop? Where are you going to sleep? What are you going to eat? How are you going to get from the airport to the hotel? All of that stuff is not taught as a pilot. And this is This goes into almost operations of your general aviation aircraft where you don't have that. And so that's something that you're not taught. And even still, when you find an airport to go ahead and land at and overnight at, for example, on my way to Oshkosh, I stopped at Poplar Grove, Kilo Charlie 77. And I knew that was the airport I was going to go to because that was the airport that is closest to my parents' house. That is the airport that's closest to my sister's house. And it's just a good general aviation airport. And the ForeFlight comments have a lot of great reviews for the airport, which is one thing that I have learned using ForeFlight when picking a fuel stop to look at that, to look at those comments, because those reviews are very helpful in picking a place to stop. And then, so when I got there, okay, where do I park the airplane? Where are the tie downs at? I don't think I remembered learning this in my private. I might have a vague memory, but how do you properly tie down an aircraft? How do you prepare an aircraft that's normally kept in a hangar to stay outside overnight or for a long period of time? So to answer your question, Max, those are some of the things that private pilots, instrument-rated pilots, even commercial pilots were not taught. That's a skill that is missing from training, especially if you're going to use your aircraft for literal cross-country flying. And by cross-country, I mean across the USA. Great job on the podcast, Max. Your episodes from Oshkosh were absolutely amazing, and I've learned something in each one. I've downloaded the WeatherSpork app on my iPhone. Absolutely amazing tool. Holy cow, did I not know that was there. So thanks for that interview. And I'm about to go downstairs and watch Mercury 13. So great job, Max. It was great meeting you in person there in Oshkosh, and keep up the great work.
Thank you, Mike. Nice to meet you there in person. Mike runs the Flying in Life podcast and interviewed me some time ago on the show, and we did get to meet at AirVenture. Now, a couple of things that I thought of when he talked about airport planning. I remember bringing a Cirrus back from Richmond with a relatively new private pilot who had looked at where to find cheapest fuel along the way, and he told me that one of our last fuel stops late in the day was going to be at this tiny airport in New Mexico that had the cheapest fuel. Well, when I looked at it, it had about a 35-foot wide runway, and the wind was predicted to be a direct crosswind. Oh, and we're going to be landing at night after it's dark. So I vetoed that immediately. I got to tell you, on these long cross-country flights, I have a bias to going to the big, large airports. They're a little bit more expensive, but that certainly has been paid off. For example, the flight I was talking about where we landed at Rapid City, our next stop was in Indianapolis, and I swear this gentleman used almost the entire runway, and it was about 8,000 feet. So it really pays, especially at night, to go to big airports. Now, in terms of selecting FBOs, you'll definitely want to call ahead. Back in 2000, I was bringing my Cessna 210 back with my partner from Florida. Fortunately, we called ahead. It was late at night. We were going to stop in Baton Rouge, and we learned that they weren't going to be there when we arrived and that there would be something on the order of a $100 call-out fee for them to come out and let us out of the airport. So we changed our plans, and we went somewhere else that night. Also, if you are looking for transient parking, take a look at the airport diagrams. You can usually find these in places like ForeFlight under procedures and just look for airport and diagram. And often transient parking is marked on those diagrams. And if not, just call ahead either to the airport management or to the FBO, and they'll help you out. And here's an email from Philip in Maryland. He says, here are a few things that I could think of. Number one, ident. He says, the first time into KESN while on a cross-country for my private certificate, a tower I had been to several times asked me to ident. Long pause as I thought about what that meant and then searched for that button. Number two, full VOR names used by ATC instead of three-letter IDs. Sometimes the names are nothing close to the ID. Shortly after getting my IFR rating, I was leaving MMU at midnight for my third leg. The poor controller was getting so frustrated with me as I just wasn't getting the clearance correct. He was using the full names and my tired brain couldn't keep up. Once I finally got it, I realized he was giving me as filed, but reading it out. And number three, figuring out how to get IFR clearance at remote airports. This is just one of those things I thought would be easier with technology today, but turns out it is still an art. And by the way, I keep a phone number for NorCal Approach, which covers a large area of Northern California, and I can always pick up the phone and give them a call for a clearance if I need to. Number four, Parallel runways and vectors to final. No matter what final vector they give you, make sure you get on the localizer as soon as possible. My first time flying into RDU, I was vectored through the localizer and back around as I was one of 5 aircraft coming in on 23 right and 23 left was being used at the time for departures. Being my first time into an airport with parallel runways, when ATC gave me my final vector, it left me just left of the localizer, and I realized it as ATC came up with much concern that I appeared to be lined up with 23 left. Number 5, how to fuel and self-serve. We just talked about that. He says, the day of my private practical, my airplane needed fuel and the truck was broken. I had never done that and no one from the school was there. I didn't even know where the pump was located on my airport. And number 6, planning cross-country fueling and FBO hours. Similar to number 5, it's a good idea to call unfamiliar FBOs, especially at small airports. Once on a cross-country, I showed up after hours, and they didn't have self-serve. Yep, that cost me a $100 after-hours fee. And 7, airports without TAFs, that would be terminal area forecasts, they have less of everything, less lighting, good markings, instrument approaches, and so on. And then in a follow-up message, Phil said, this past fall, a friend invited us to a fishing trip with several others, and since his 182 couldn't haul all of us, I flew a DA-40 down from Maryland with a non-pilot passenger from the Carroll County, Maryland airport, and planned to meet him at the Billy Mitchell Hatteras, North Carolina airport. Since that airport does not have fuel, I would need to stop short for fuel at new-to-me airport. At this point on trips, most airports are new to me. That makes sense. He said, I have no experience with airfields that have tow plane traffic and didn't realize that the prior caller was a tow plane. Not wanting to disrupt the flow, I decided to swing wide and switch runways using 3-5 instead of 5. As I turned final and began looking down the runway, I kept seeing chevrons, and a lot of them. In fact, I soon realized that the displaced threshold went almost a third of the runway, and he says that was about 1,000 feet. Why didn't I glance at the airport diagram one last time? By that time, I was slow and a few feet off the ground, holding it on the backside of the power curve. Spotting the threshold, I sat it down and came to a bit of a bumpy, slow taxi and turned off without any issues. It was then that I noticed the very cracked runway with grass growing on it and the fact that the plane that had called in was a tow plane. Evidently, 3-5 was the runway the banner tow planes set up all their stuff on so they don't disrupt traffic on runway 5. Runway 35 is 3,300 feet long with a 1,000-foot displaced threshold as opposed to my intended runway, which was 4,300 feet long. So lessons learned: 1, always brief all available runways. 2, be pilot in command and use the runway you choose given conditions. 3, especially if you make a last-minute change, look at your diagram. 4, you can always go around. Yes, you can, Phil. And this reminds me of a trip that I made many, many years ago before I got my CFI. One of my longest trips at that point from Northern California to Scottsdale, Arizona, and I stopped at Kingman, Arizona to refuel. And I had set up for the runway that I thought would be best given the wind, and then I heard someone else in the pattern who was landing another runway, and I thought, oh, well, he probably knows better than I. And so I landed following that aircraft to the runway he chose. Wouldn't you know, I had this monster crosswind, and it was really a very bad choice. I met the gentleman at the fuel pumps, where I learned that he was a student pilot. So I had totally let my judgment be swayed simply because someone else was using a different runway. And here's an email from David in Sunnyvale, California. He says, radio work was the big shock after I received my license. Yes, I learned how to call flight service to open and close flight plans and how to call up approach or center for flight following, but mostly we didn't use that for very long. My sadistic CFI, not one of my students obviously, always had a sick passenger, fire, electrical failure, engine failure, flight into IMC. Well, you get the picture, such that we didn't talk on the radio for very long. Flying most cross-country flights after I earned my ticket, it took quite a while to learn the range of expected communications, what the phrases really mean, and especially to have the courage to ask for clarification when I wasn't sure I understood what was wanted. And also that I could use approach to help me fly simpler routes that required Charlie or Delta transitions rather than flying a circuitous route. The Bay Tour was very intimidating to me for that reason, as there were multiple towers and approach frequencies with lots of handoffs and a series of altitudes and heading restrictions. Speaking of the Bay Tour, are you planning to update your Bay Tour map to reflect the changes to the new San Francisco Class Bravo airspace? Thanks for that, David. So the Bay Tour, for folks who are outside the area, is a series of routes that one can fly in the San Francisco Bay Area, both for sightseeing to see all the really cool stuff around here, as well as to transition to Bravo to get from between airports on different sides of the Class Bravo. And yes, David, I have actually completed the latest version of the Bay Tour map, but I haven't had a made up yet, so it's not yet available through local pilot shops. Now, here's an email from Patreon supporter Michael, who says, to me, the answer is an overwhelming understanding how to use all available services in an airport. For example, how to find piston-friendly FBOs and what FBOs can do for you. I learned to fly in a large flight school where the focus was on get them in and get them out quickly. My flight instructors would frequently take me to fancy FBOs to eat their cookies and drink their coffee. I was amazed how luxurious many of these FBOs were. We would land, use their facilities, and leave about an hour later at no charge. Wow. When I received my private and started venturing out on my own, I quickly became aware of the plethora of gotcha fees and high-priced gas and formed an opinion that large FBOs are only for corporate jet general aviation. I began to think of FBOs as evil empires that loathe small GA aircraft and do everything they can to discourage us little guys from using their services. They just don't want piston aircraft on their ramps. I began to avoid FBOs and narrowed my destinations to airports with public tie-downs. The unfortunate side effect of dodging FBOs was that my overall enjoyment of arriving at an airport dwindled. Not having a building close to an aircraft to get out of the weather, to use the restrooms for flight planning, get a drink or snack, and organize transportation made it way less fun. I spent years battling my way around airports and avoiding FBOs. I later began instrument training with local CFIs and once again started patronizing FBOs at their suggestions. Now a little older and wiser and out of the structured meat grinder flight schools, I learned how to identify piston-friendly FBOs. I learned to read other pilots' comments online through electronic flight bags, apps like ForeFlight, social media, call ahead and ask if they had an FBO car. He says, who knew FBOs had cars to loan? Ask for help with accommodations and local knowledge to enhance my experiences. The discovery of FBO cars to run in town to eat made the extra pennies at the pump very much worthwhile. I think flight schools and CFIs do their students and the industry at large a disservice if they fail to teach students about the experience of being a pilot. I fear we lose pilots after they graduate because no one takes new pilots under their wing, yes, pun intended, and opens their eyes to the lifestyle of private aviation. Love the podcast. You're awesome. Well, thanks so much for that, Michael, and I'm glad to see that your view on FBOs has turned around and they're not just totally the evil empire. And finally, here's an email from a Patreon supporter, Nick, and I had sent Nick a note at one point asking him for suggestions on topics, and wouldn't you know, his first suggestion just fit squarely in with everything that we've been talking about. Nick says, during training, all my cross-country flights were in the same general area, the Midwest, and didn't involve overnight stops. Now that I'm traveling for business and pleasure by GA aircraft, I have had to begin learning how to select and interact with FBOs at a wide range of airport sizes. Learning what to expect and how to select an FBO would be a great topic. I trained at a small airport with a grass strip. That would be K64, and everything was self-service. My first business trip to a Class C airport, KDSM, which I think is Des Moines, I've been there before, on business was a bit intimidating, and I had no idea how to pick between the two FBOs and what to expect. I'm guessing it goes the other way for pilots training at large airports on their first overnight trip to a small uncontrolled field with an FBO that looks like Gomer Pyle's garage or is unattended with the courtesy car keys under the doormat. Nick, thanks so much. I love that image of Gomer Pyle's garage. By the way, many years ago when I lived in New Jersey, I flew out of Hackettstown Airport, which was a farmer's field essentially that had been paved, and it was next to a great big huge barn. And sure enough, the FBO office was this tiny little corner of the barn, which was kind of funny, but it was very quaint. I sure hope it's still there after all these years. So I went through and put together my list of things that I think that pilots often are not taught as student pilots. Some of these things have already been mentioned, but here is my top 20 list. Number 1, how to prepare for a flight review. Obviously, you don't need to know this until 2 years after you become a private pilot, but I'm going to go ahead and include a link to an FAA document in which I made a contribution. You'll see my name in the credits on the document, and you'll find a link to it either on our Patreon page or in the show notes. Number 2, using clearance delivery, approach and departure control, which we've talked about earlier. Number 3, complex and high performance endorsements. So I think sometimes student pilots don't realize, hey, you need extra endorsements to fly these higher performance and complex aircraft. Number 4, checking out in other airplanes. People just don't know. Can I take my license and just jump into some other type of airplane? No, afraid you can't. Actually, legally you could from an FAA standpoint, but it's the insurance companies that wouldn't like it. Flying in the mountains. Boy, I'm amazed sometimes at the number of crashes I read about it from low-time pilots who've decided to venture off into the mountains. Sadly, nobody told them that they really ought to have some additional training before they go doing that. Number 6, the dangers of flying at night. And that's what my presentation is going to be about at AOPA's Regional Fly-In, which is, among other things, that the accident rates are significantly higher at night. Number 7, It can happen to me. When I first became a pilot, I kind of figured all these things I read about that other pilots were doing would never happen to me. And guess what? Over the years, some of them have happened to me. And so you got to realize, just about any of these things can happen to you. Number 8, flying at night without a moon. Did you know that 90% of all fatal accidents at night occur on dark nights where there's no moon or there's an overcast? Yeah, I bet your flight instructor didn't tell you that when you were a student pilot. So it really makes a lot of sense to have a personal minimum of having perhaps a quarter moon when you go flying at night. Renting a plane at another flight school, that would be number 9. How do you go about that? Well, most flight schools are going to require that you spend at least an hour with a flight instructor at their school before you're allowed to rent one of their airplanes. It's not like going to your local car rental agency. They're not just going to give you an airplane when you show up at a different airport. Number 10, planning entries to airports with multiple runways. I think a lot of training goes to less complex airports with single runways or parallel runways. But boy, when you have to figure out an airport with 3 and 4 intersecting runways, where that runway is and how to approach it and how to enter the pattern, that gets a little more difficult. Number 11, managing descents. With a basic Cessna 152 or 172, you probably weren't that high in your cross-country flight, and you could just wait until you saw the airport, cut the throttle to idle, and spiral your way on down. That just doesn't make sense when you're at higher altitudes and in more powerful aircraft. Number 12, how to buy a new or a used airplane. And if you want some suggestions on that, if you're thinking about buying a Cirrus, let me know. But I think that there are limited resources for people to figure that out. Number 13, how to conduct flights so passengers will want to fly with you again. And my advice to you is fly that plane like you have 100 passengers in the back who you want to come back. So you want to fly at times of day when there's minimal turbulence. You don't want to scare your passengers. I hear some terrible stories about how some pilots have thought it was funny to scare their passengers. I just think that's terrible. So don't do it. Your passengers do not appreciate that kind of BS. Number 14, what to do if you're ramp checked by the FAA. If as you land, a nice person comes up to you and says, "Hi, I'm from the FAA. I'm here to help." Woo. You have 7 things that you have to show them, and then I would tell them that you are in a hurry to get to your next appointment. So that's going to be your 3 personal documents and the 4 things, the AROW for the airplane. And that will be the end of your ramp check, hopefully. Number 15, what to do if ATC tells you to advise when ready to copy a phone number. Should you call the number? Should you not call the number? I can tell you one thing. If you don't call the number, as some attorneys advise, they're going to be pretty annoyed with you. These days, we seem to have a kinder, gentler FAA, so my inclination personally is to call the number if I get those kinds of calls, and usually that ends the whole thing right there. Number 16, Part 134.5 Charter Operations. Well, you may have learned by now that Part 135 is the FAA part of the regulations that deal with charter operations. Part 134.5 is when, you don't quite meet those regulations, but you're still taking money to fly people from point A to point B. If you think that that's perhaps the situation you're in, you better stop doing it. Number 17, if you're going to hit something while taxiing, hit something cheap. I just couldn't believe one of our club planes a couple of years ago went down the wrong taxiway. And unfortunately, it was a dead-end taxiway. So what do they do when they got to the end of that narrow taxiway? Sure, they tried to make a U-turn. And they also put a very large dent in the wing when it hit the light pole at the end of that taxiway. If you make a mistake, sometimes it's just easier to shut down the aircraft, get out the tow bar, and turn the airplane around by hand. Number 18, how to use self-serve fuel. Well, we talked about that. Number 19, how to hear a weak signal on the radio and what to do when your center or approach signal gets so weak that you can no longer hear them. And quick tip on that, if there's a weak signal you want to hear and it's kind of chopping in and out, you want to unsquelch your radio. So older radios, you're going to turn the squelch knob. Newer ones, you're going to push the knob that's labeled squelch, which is often the volume knob. And if you're losing center or approach because they're so weak, well, you might want to talk to them quickly and get an idea from them of what frequency would be better to reach them on. Often, if they're starting to get weak, they will tell you things like, in 10 miles, contact this frequency. So you want to do that when they start to get weak and not wait until after they're gone altogether. And number 20, things they don't teach student pilots. They don't teach you how to disconnect the Hobbs meter before you fly and how to remember to reconnect it after the flight. There you have it. 20 things your CFI didn't teach you as a student pilot. Now stick around because coming up, we've got lots of listener feedback and questions right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. Before we get to feedback and listener questions, a quick thank you to folks who have left reviews for this show at various places. So in the Apple Podcast app, which you may be listening to, formerly called iTunes on your iPhone, Not So says that this is my go-to app. And Jose Mack says, wow, as an instructor, I recommended it to several students and friends. And Allie Howard 18 says, the first one I listened to. Thanks very much for that. And if you're using our dedicated app for the iPhone and iPad, we have one review left on the iOS app, and that's from Mahi Time. So it sounds like this person's a fisherman. Mahi Time says, this is the best general aviation podcast. Thank you, Mr. Truscott, for bringing us the best GA podcast. You're very welcome, but please just call me Max. I'm pretty informal. And let's see, for folks who are using our dedicated Android app, we've got a number of those because I just found them last week. So I want to thank Bill Forelli, who left a review, Leon Harding, who said he's in LA airspace and that the podcast has helped him with so many concepts. And Thomas Kaufman says, fantastic app. So thanks everyone for those reviews. Please go ahead, and if you haven't left us a review, go ahead and do that, especially if you've got our dedicated iOS app. Just go to the App Store on your iPhone or iPad, and you can leave a review. Now let's go to listener feedback. And these are all about NOTAMs, and listeners are not happy. This comes from Bryant, who's a Patreon sponsor. He says, it seems to me the NTSB chickened out. They should have recommended a complete modernization of the NOTAM system in keeping with modern technology and today's understanding of how humans recognize, consume, and act on important new information. Can you imagine if we presented lane closure warnings to drivers on interstate highways in the NOTAM format? And an email from Blaine in Utah. He says, thanks for your report on the Air Canada close call. Unfortunately, I see myself in that incident. I retired after 27 years flying for 2 air carriers in the 737s and 747s. I also have 23 years of military flying. More than half of my flying was international. As in this case, fatigue is a way of life in the airline business, even for non-reserve crews. I even fell asleep on short final one night when flying into an airport in Japan. As with this crew, it was not uncommon for me to need to sift through dozens of pages of NOTAMs, weather, aircraft status, etc. As you know, none of that information is in actual English, but in code. Over the years, I've filed dozens of NASA forms addressing the above issues. This Air Canada incident shows that over my career, little has changed in fixing basic systemic problems. Thanks for the great podcast. You teach this old-timer something new every episode. And Blaine, wow, I got to say that's kind of sad. But, I commented that the NOTAM system probably is about the same as it was 60 years ago. So you're right. You've gone through your entire career and it hasn't substantially changed, which I think is a travesty. And from Twitter, Christian says that he flies that flight, Air Canada 759, about 15 times a year between Toronto and San Francisco. He says, as a pilot and engineer, I think more automation is needed. Why not show the NOTAMs on the MFD when they become relevant? Why not georeference NOTAMs precisely to show them in their place in our glass cockpits? Put the GPS coordinates on the obstruction or the inoperative equipment, etc. Great comment, Christian. You're absolutely right. Now, here's an email I got from an airline pilot, a friend of mine, and this person asked to remain anonymous, so I will not identify him or her. And this was regarding my comment that there were 10 pages of NOTAMs for the Air Canada flight. And the comment starts, 10 pages, exclamation point. We print dispatch releases 45 to 60 minutes prior to pushback. Sometimes we only have 29 minutes to do a turn at an outstation. It is a continuing challenge to read all the NOTAMs. In parentheses, there are also so many NOTAM modifications to the IAPs, that would be the instrument approach procedures, in addition to the weather information and route info. At least in the airlines, the NOTAM info is limited to the airports. I remember doing my flight planning in general aviation for a simple local training flight at KSAC, that would be the Sacramento Executive Airport. DUATs might give me NOTAMs for Washington State, Hawaii, Nevada, Idaho, and SoCal. Yeah, that would be pretty irrelevant for a flight in California. Also, recall the Singapore Air flight that crashed in Taiwan on Halloween in 1999 or 2000 because they didn't find the NOTAM and took off on a closed runway. Mind you, runway and taxiway closure information is on the ATIS, which I always check prior to arrival. I make best efforts to pull NOTAMs at notams.faa.gov prior to arriving at the airport and getting my release, so at least I have something to start with. And then in a follow-on message, this pilot wrote, also filing my page of NOTAMs with things that start tomorrow or later when I'm trying to prepare for today's flight. So there's a diligent airline pilot, and we've also heard from a retired airline pilot, and they think the NOTAM system stinks. So FAA, do you hear us? Now let's go to listener questions. This comes from Jeffrey in Michigan. He writes, "Hi, Max. How do you fly a crosswind landing in a Cessna 172? Would you use no flaps or minimal flaps? I'd like to know what your thoughts are, as I've heard differing opinions on the subject. Thanks, Jeffrey." Well, Jeffrey, I'm sure that if you ask 5 different flight instructors, you'll probably get at least 6 different answers to this question. I'm not sure there's a definitive correct answer, but what I can tell you is that I have always read that when flying in strong crosswinds in 172, that you should land at probably around 20 degrees of flaps. I don't know that I would ever go to 0 flaps on a Cessna because of a strong crosswind, partially because I know that airplane is going to float like crazy, especially if you're at all fast. And I'm at a short runway here, so I like to get the airplane on the ground before I start scaring myself and run out of runway. Now, it's interesting, the answer is going to be different on other types of aircraft. For example, on the Cirrus SR20 and the SR22, you're supposed to always land with full flaps, even in a strong crosswind. But the answer is different if you're in the Cirrus Vision jet, the SF50. There you're supposed to limit yourself to 50% flaps if you have a strong crosswind. Thanks for your question, Jeffrey. And here's an email that I got from Keith in Georgia, and I'm going to read part of it as it relates to our next question. He says, "Another recent experience has given me an idea to suggest for a future show how to regain the confidence to fly when an aviation accident occurs close to home. I'm dealing with a lapse in confidence that has me questioning if it's worth the risk to keep flying the only way I can afford to fly, renting high-time planes from local flight schools. On April 25th, an instruction flight in a plane rented from one of our local flight schools where I rent had a catastrophic engine failure during a training flight. Oil covered the windshield. They attempted to land on a road. It didn't go well. The instructor was killed. The student and a backseat passenger were seriously injured." He says, "The lack of confidence isn't in my airmanship, though it makes me want to spend more time memorizing and practicing emergency procedures." He does say that as we go on here that he really needs to get his confidence back. And now let's listen to this question that came in today.
Hi, this is Chris. I've recently lost 2 friends in aircraft accidents. One even in a brand new machine. I have heard you talk on the podcast before about losing aviation friends, and I guess it's hitting me hard and instilling my confidence in my own aviation and the risks that we take every day to enjoy this. Do you have any advice for those pilots who are out there who lose a friend through aviation? Thank you.
Well, Keith and Chris, I think that having your confidence shaken is probably a pretty normal thing. Certainly it's happened to me a couple of times in my flying career for various reasons. And I think, frankly, if it weren't shaken and you were always confident, then maybe you really are overconfident. I see sometimes people who have the bravado and, no fear and, frankly, overconfidence. I would much prefer to see a pilot who's not like that and who occasionally has their confidence shaken, because that's going to be a more careful pilot who's more deliberate and, approaches flying, I think, more safely. So to me, I think the most important thing if you've lost a friend is, what can you learn from it and what can you do about it? First of all, I'm really sorry for your loss, Chris. It's tough losing friends. I know that it really, really hurts to lose friends, especially when they're doing something that we love. And not only do we lose a dear friend in the process, but I think it also makes us think about our own flying and our mortality. And frankly, these really are good things to contemplate, even if they are hard, but especially if they help us improve our flying safety and if it helps us to realize that life is short. So it does make sense for us to think about how we want to spend our time, the activities we choose, and whether these are the things we truly want to do in our life. Now, for me, I continue to fly and continue to teach, even though I know that both of those involve risk and liability, because I truly enjoy them both, and because I want to help others to be as safe as possible. So yes, I know that if I wanted to be much safer, I would not fly, but what the heck? I just love it too much. Now, I think the one really bad thing about flying is we do sometimes lose our pilot friends to flying accidents. And if you're listening to this and you're young, then you may not have lost anyone before. But I'm guessing just about everyone who's over 50 and is a pilot has probably lost multiple friends to plane accidents in the past. I have been to way too many plane accident funerals, and I'm always struck by how invariably you hear people say he or she was a really good pilot, almost exactly those words. And most of the time that is absolutely true. They were a really good pilot, which I think leads to the question, why do good pilots die in plane accidents? And I think there are three major reasons. Probably about 80% of accidents are the result of pilot error or judgment. And that means that even really good pilots can still make mistakes. Now, most of the time, pilots catch those mistakes before they lead to accidents, but sometimes they don't. And I think some of those errors are judgment errors where the pilot had other alternatives, including perhaps not to fly that day, or made some other poor choice. So one positive thing I think we can do when we lose a pilot friend, especially if our confidence has been shaken, is to just rededicate ourselves to making the best possible decisions related to flying. I've said before, when I'm faced with a tough decision, I always think about how would the accident report read? And that leads me to make more conservative decisions that hopefully are keeping me safer when I fly. Now, some of the errors that pilots make are not judgment errors, but they're of skill type errors where they don't perform a pilot's skill correctly. And other accidents are a combination of judgment errors and skill errors. For example, the pilot I talked about who died at my home airport last month was very experienced, but he was fast on the approach and he didn't decide early enough in the process to go around, which is a judgment error. And then he bounced, which was a pilot skill error. Exactly why he crashed on the go-around, I don't know, but I do know that if he were given a do-over, in retrospect, he would have handled his landing very differently. But unfortunately, we don't get do-overs, so the best that can happen from an accident such as this or the death of your friends, Chris, is that we learn from those bad experiences of others and use them for positive change. In your case, that might lead to some small, subtle decisions about your future flying decisions. Or someday you may encounter someone you know who is about to take off when they shouldn't, and you'll hopefully decide to intervene in some way to get them to reconsider their decision. Years ago, I was watching several people standing around just waiting to see if a pilot was really going to start the airplane and taxi off while it still had ice on it. Now, I was the only one who walked over and said, "Hey, you really are going to remove the ice before you go, aren't you?" And that's all it took to get him to do the right thing. And as for having had your confidence shaken, well, I think it makes sense to get back in the airplane and fly. But you might want to think about bringing along a flight instructor, and I would encourage you to talk with a flight instructor beforehand. Have that conversation before you get into the airplane about how the death of your friends or pilots at your airport have really affected you and shaken your confidence. Now, if you want, there are also things you can do to memorialize your friends. I lost a really dear friend 20 years ago, Marvin Weinreb. He was a doctor in the Flying Doctors Organization that I was in. And 6 people died in that crash, 4 of whom I knew, and I was at the crash site, within 40 minutes of it, and there were still people in the airplane. They were all dead. But what I did is I worked with the FAA, and we created the Marvin 1 arrival into Oakland Airport. And for probably 15 years, airline pilots, every single one of them, was cleared for the Marvin 1 arrival. Now, most of them probably didn't know who Marvin was, except for those who read the article I put in Flight magazine, which talked about Marvin, the work that he did with the flying doctors, and what a kind gentleman he was. He was probably about 25 years my senior. He was kind of, to me, like a grandfather type figure. I really loved the guy, and it really made me grin to think that there was now a waypoint named Marvin, and that every jet going into Oakland was saying his name as they went in. So think about, other ways that you want to help remember, these friends of yours that you've lost. But for sure, I think you probably do want to get back into the airplane, but do it at your own time and pace. And again, I'm very sorry for your loss. And if you have a question you'd like me to answer on the show, please go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Listener Questions, and you can record your question, which I'll play it on the show, or you can send me an email. And if you think someday you might buy a new or slightly used Cirrus, please contact me now. I can help arrange a free demo flight if you're thinking about a new Cirrus and help you understand all the factors involved in buying a new versus a used Cirrus. I specialize in Cirrus aircraft, both in training and acquisition of aircraft with people around the country. And if you'll do me one small favor, please think of at least one friend you think might enjoy the show. Contact them and tell them how to find it. If they're familiar with podcasts, tell them how to find our show. And if they're not, tell them how to go to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store to download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast app. Until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.